as you know, the people in Gaza and the people in Lebanon have no support from anywhere. In Gaza, we saw and we continue to see genocide taking place. Egypt doesn't do anything. Turkey's government doesn't do anything. The Jordanians don't do anything. These regimes in the Persian Gulf, they don't do anything. And so, and actually what they did was that instead of like Iran supporting the resistance, they went and collaborated with Trump and put a stamp of approval on his ceasefire, which was a fake ceasefire. They went to Egypt and they had a grand ceremony and they celebrated Trump, the leaders from the region. And since then, around 1,000, probably now more than 1,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been slaughtered. Lots of kids in the last few days. A family or two burned alive. One family, I tweeted footage of a family burning in the fires, burning, a person still moving. Catastrophic. You won't see this in the Western media, of course, and Western journalists won't tweet these things because, it's not worthy. It's not newsworthy, I suppose, for them. But so in Lebanon, we now see a repeat of what's going on in Gaza. And the Israelis have openly said that we want to create another Gaza. And of course, the Europeans, they won't sanction them. European parliamentarians won't say anything. Parliamentarians from different countries across Europe or the UK or Australia or New Zealand, no one's going to sanction the Israelis. No one's going to punish them. In fact, during this period, as the genocide in Gaza has been ongoing and as the genocidal attacks in Lebanon have been ongoing, you see Iranians being sanctioned, and but not just by the Americans, but by all of these countries affiliated to the United States. So in Lebanon, again, we saw what they were doing to the people in the south. The Lebanese government, of course, they're collaborators with Americans, the prime minister and the president. They were installed by them. They don't have popular support. The Americans forced these two people into power. And the Western embassies, NGOs, the Lebanese president, the prime minister, they are basically preventing the refugees from the south from moving around in different parts of the country. And the Arab regimes, the Qataris and the Saudis and the Emiratis, they are basically encouraging their takfiri, the ISIS, Al-Qaeda type, the Wahhabi Salafi type, to prevent the refugees from going to their neighborhoods. So you have the supporters of the resistance, which are from all walks of life and from all religions and sects, but of course predominantly Shia. They are trapped. They can't leave, and their cities are being flattened intentionally with Western support. And they're not allowed to receive aid. They're blocking aid from Iran, from Iraq. So the government in Lebanon is trying to humiliate the supporters of the resistance, to break them, to bring them to their knees, to impoverish them. And it's an utterly evil president, utterly evil prime minister. But and then you have Al-Qaeda in Syria blocking routes for Hezbollah to get supplies. And then you have the Israeli regime flattening the country. So the last place where many of the refugees could go was Beirut. And in parts of Beirut, they won't allow them to go. So Lebanese citizens, people who've been there for generation after generation, who've been there before Lebanon was created, whose families were there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, they're not allowed to move around in their own country. So this conspiracy between Western embassies and Western NGOs and the Western installed government and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Zionists to crush the resistance was ongoing. And then the Israelis said, we're going to flatten Beirut. They openly say it, that we're going to flatten it with the in southern Beirut, you have hundreds of thousands of people, mostly supporters of Hezbollah, the resistance, and the supporters of the Palestinians. Because in Lebanon, there is a segment of society that's affiliated like to the Lebanese forces that hate the Palestinians. They're allies of the genocidal forces of Zionism. And of course, anyone who's in the Western camp will do what the West wants. So you have these people who stand against the resistance for a host of reasons. So the Israeli regime wanted to flatten that so that the refugees who went to Dahi and to Beirut would have to leave. And also the Israeli regime is warning Christian communities and others that host refugees to force them to leave. So in Tyre, for example, or Sur, they give warnings. So it's sort of like the Nazis searching for Jews. Here, the Zionists are searching for Muslims and warning the Christians not to host them in areas where they do. So if Beirut, or especially the south of Beirut, is flattened, then you have half of Lebanon as refugees. And then the government won't let tents, Iran send tents or food or anything like that. They want them to go hungry. So Iran knew that this would be a terrible situation, a massacre of people across Beirut, flattening their homes, people on the streets, people who had lives, and their crime was that they supported the Palestinian cause. They tried to draw off the forces of the Israeli regime as they were carrying out genocide. They made sacrifices to help save the Palestinian people. In other words, the supporters of the resistance in Lebanon are the most dignified of people on this planet, the most honorable people of this planet. And those who try to crush them, of course, the most dishonorable people on this planet, whether Lebanese or Syrian or Zionist. So the Iranians warned the Israeli regime that if you bomb Dahiya or Beirut, we'll strike. And for a few days, the Israeli regime backed down. We had that phone conversation between Trump and Netanyahu, where supposedly or allegedly or possibly Trump warned Netanyahu and attacked him and insulted him, which I think was a significant, what Axios, a very dishonest outlet, but by publishing it, I think there was a lot of significance in this, because I think that regardless of what Trump's intentions were, I think the powerful people who are supporting Axios, who are the Zionists, I think they probably, though, at least that faction or that part of the Zionists in power in the United States, probably intentionally humiliated Netanyahu. It was not a piece of news that was wanted to show differences. It really, I think, humiliated Netanyahu, and I think there was probably a purpose behind that. But in any case, for a few days, the Israeli regime refrained from slaughtering people in Beirut. They continued to slaughter them across the country, and we'll get to that in a moment. But then they carried out this strike. And I think intentionally, they tried to do it in a way so that it wouldn't be too severe. 2 ordinary people died, as you rightly pointed out. No one from Hezbollah was martyred. The 2 people I assume on the streets or on some of the floor of the building, they were martyred. But or maybe they were just in their houses and the Israelis decided to bomb those houses. I think the Israelis didn't carry out a heavy strike because they wanted to make the Iranians prevent the Iranians from striking back. In other words, sort of like some sort of borderline attack, so that Iran wouldn't be provoked enough, and then they would do it again and again, let's say after a few days, and then normalize slaughter in Lebanon. I mean, it's amazing what sort of creatures we're talking about, what sort of monsters we're talking about, their mentality and their supporters in the West and in the region. But the Iranians said no, and they, as we saw, carried out heavy strikes, very effective strikes. And then the Israeli regime struck back, and they, again, were punished by the Iranians. No major damage was done in Iran, but I think it was, whatever happened, the very fact that Trump was begging to have this come to an end has significance in itself. And the fact that Netanyahu disobeyed Trump, even though publicly he said he was going to stop it and he calls the shots, I think this was a humiliation for Trump, and it shows how ineffective and incapable he is. Just like the previous report that came out humiliated Netanyahu. Here, Trump was humiliated. Of course, Trump brought it upon himself because he said in public that he's the one who calls the shots. So even if it's for show, it's still a humiliation. But because he showed that he's incapable of imposing his will, being the benefactor of the Israeli regime. That's where all the power and money and wealth comes from. So for now, what we see is that the Israelis are they're very much afraid of striking Dahia or Beirut, but now they're hammering other parts of southern Lebanon in rage and anger, and so killing more and more civilians, and they're just bombing homes and apartment blocks and whoever's in them. And of course, Western media is completely indifferent and silent. But I don't think that Iran will even be the Iranian will be willing to accept this for long. And in any case, we're in a stalemate situation. The Israeli regime has obviously been hurt in Lebanon badly. They've been humiliated, and they can't destroy Beirut on the one hand. And on the other hand, the siege in the Persian Gulf that works both ways continues. And so, we have to see how things play out.
But when it seems that the Israelis, as they reported in their media, they didn't think that Iran would respond. But when it comes to the ongoing attacks to the southern part of Lebanon, what would be the reaction from the resistance? I'm talking about Yemen, because yesterday we've seen Yemen sending drones to Israel. And then we had the head of Iranian Council of Experts, Sadiq Al-Larijani. He said that it's not going to be Beirut, it's going to be southern part of Lebanon, it's going to be Gaza, and Iran is doing that. Iran is, with ongoing talks or messages between Iran and the United States, all these cases are considered. We know that, because on the other hand, we had the Hamas forces reporting that Iran informed them that Iran is trying to do its best to bring the case of Gaza into the negotiation, the talks they have with the United States. What do we know about that?
Well, from the very beginning, Gaza was a part of the negotiations. The Iranians said that there must be a ceasefire and an end to the war on all fronts, especially Lebanon. The reason why they said especially Lebanon was because the slaughter carried out in Lebanon was reminiscent of the darkest days in Gaza. Every day, tens of Lebanese civilians were being martyred. And as Western media and Western journalists based in Beirut and in the West were saying that the Israelis are bombing Hezbollah strongholds, we were seeing images from social media of dead children and dead families and people being pulled out from under the rubble in Lebanon, not something that the Western media would tell us. And I think by now everyone should recognize that Western media is just, they shouldn't bother even following them or their journalists, corporate media and regime media. But more recently, the Iranians have been more explicit about naming Gaza. So they named Lebanon because of the sheer amount of slaughter in Lebanon. But in recent weeks, we've seen an increase in the slaughter in Gaza. And every day, multiple people and children are being massacred. And as I said, I posted I retweeted a post where with footage showing a family burning alive. And it didn't even register in the West. I mean, these journalists are just so inhumane. They become so, I don't know what's wrong with these people, these politicians in the West. It's sort of like they're under some sort of spell or it's just amazing. It's beyond my comprehension, their indifference to the people of Gaza and Palestine and Lebanon. And a couple of days ago, they shot a 7-month-old child in the head in the West Bank. And I saw a couple of Western media outlets trying to justify the killing, especially on X, the part where they sometimes, like, they have news. That's particularly horrible. So because of the increased number of people being slaughtered in Gaza every day, the Iranians have put a greater emphasis on supporting or on bringing an end to the slaughter in Gaza. But the problem in Gaza is a bit different from Lebanon, because Hamas, under duress, because all these Arab regimes in Turkey and others, they went to Trump's monkey show, his circus in Egypt, and they put a stamp of approval on that one-sided, fake ceasefire. So at the negotiating table, it's very difficult for the Iranians to do all that much for Gaza, because the Americans say we already have a ceasefire, and everyone, Erdogan and Abdullah and Jordan and Sisi and all the regimes in the Persian Gulf, they put their, the Pakistani, I think Prime Minister was there, they all put their stamp of approval on this. And so I don't know how far the Iranians can go, but the Iranians have told Hamas that they are insisting on making sure that Gaza is included in this ceasefire.
What is the situation in the Persian Gulf? Donald Trump said the blockade is still in place, and Iran says that the blockade cannot continue. And if the United States is honest in the way that it's behaving, not only the blockade, the case of the frozen Iranian assets. And there we are receiving mixed messages coming out of the region. On one side, Pakistanis are reporting that the situation is good, everything is perfect with the negotiations, everything is getting more positive. On the other hand, we see these sort of confrontations between Iran and the United States, between Iran and Israel. And last night, we've seen the Vice President of the United States talking about maybe based on what he said, the objectives of the United States are different from what Israel has at this particular moment. So what is the assessment on the part of Iranians, and how serious is the United States in the ongoing negotiation or talks or messages, whatever it is?
Well, I think it's obvious that someone like the Vice President of the United States would speak this way. And we see more leaks being more leaks about Trump or about Trump and Netanyahu, or where Trump says that if you continue like this, you'll be on your own. Part of this, I think, is we shouldn't take it any seriously. But part of it, even if we consider it to be just show, I think shows that the regime in Washington understands that the American public are not happy, and this is becoming a big issue. And so they have to be seen as having agency, as having their own decision-making process, because people across the world and even in the United States increasingly are coming to the recognition that the Zionists are in charge, that they have the upper hand. We're seeing right now how the Israeli genocidal military is being fused with the American military. We see that as the genocide progresses, the Israeli regime is taking, and the oligarchy, the Zionist oligarchy, are taking all the media in the United States and all the means of control and AI, and so people are seeing them take control, and they see their leaders as agents of Zionism increasingly, and so they have to try to show to the people that no, we are making our own decisions and we're not controlled by them. But I think that ultimately this is not a good sign for the Israeli regime anyway, or Zionists, because the very fact that they do have to make these statements, whether they're just for show or there's any substance behind it, indicates that things are changing in the United States and across the world. So, even if it's for show, it's not a good sign. Just like even if Trump's leaked statements regarding Netanyahu, even if it's for show, it's not a good sign for Netanyahu or his allies of the Israeli regime. For Trump to say that everyone hates Israel or everyone hates Netanyahu, it's not a good sign. Whatever the intention is for doing that. So that's one issue. So it's too early to take any of this seriously. What Vance says or what Trump says. On the battlefield, they're working together. The Israeli regime their jets are being refueled by American jets that are based in these countries in the Persian Gulf. Of their radar installations in Turkey and AWACS jets in Turkey are helping them. American jets, NATO jets. So nothing has changed. The Americans and their regional allies are collaborating, are helping the Israeli regime. They're helping down Iranian missiles, or at least attempting to down Iranian missiles. The Jordanians have been trying to block Iranian missiles and drones for the Israeli regime. As I said, the radar installations in Turkey are being used. So the Americans are using their assets across the region and their surface-to-air missile capabilities and their air force to assist Netanyahu. There's no doubt about that. So on the ground, nothing has really changed so far. And I don't think we should have any expectations for that in future. But things are changing. The fact that Netanyahu had to back off from attacking Beirut, I think that shows Iran's strength. That shows the strength of Hezbollah and the resistance. It shows the strength of the importance of Yemen and the potential that it has for causing major harm to Western economies because of their support for the genocide or the multiple genocides. And of course, the fact that Trump desperately wanted to prevent another war is an indication that Trump is in trouble and that he does not want this war. If he was, he could have just joined in and started attacking Iran, and he's brought in all those assets to the region. So he's brought in huge amounts of ammunition, jets, ground troops that would be used to attack Iranian islands and Iranian mainland and carry out operations deep inside Iran. So he's brought in all those assets. But the fact that he was so keen on nothing happening or the war from stopping or being or coming to an end, I think shows that all is not well in the United States.
I think what one of the main outcomes of this war was the new equation that everybody's talking about it in Israel. They say, we don't accept this new equation that Iran is trying to force on us, which means that the acts of resistance would hit them anytime they attack. For example, Iran said Beirut or southern part of Dahiyeh, they're going to respond. And they're talking about right now the southern part of Lebanon. If they attack, the acts of resistance would respond. They don't want this because of what has happened look at the history, Professor Marandi, and what they did to Gaza, to the West Bank. Look at the West Bank today. There is no West Bank because these settlers captured all of the land in the West Bank. And they're talking about 70% of Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu is talking about 70% of Gaza. And I mean, many people in Israel want...
Despite the ceasefire. And this is like Trump's ceasefire.
Exactly. I think that's the...
And we don't see any of those countries that went to Egypt for the ceremony, any of them up in arms about this.
And here comes the difference, in my opinion. If the axis of resistance decides to respond to Israel, it doesn't matter. The United States cannot stay in the region forever, in my opinion, because they had the bases to be there. Their bases are not there anymore, the way it was before this war started. And I don't know how capable is they now, or how willing is the United States to get back to those bases, because anything happening again between the two sides, calling Iran and Israel, Iran is going to attack and destroy again and again these radars and everything they put in GCC countries. This is the new equation in the region. Then the United States has to say, let's say, I don't know, Diego Garcia in Greece, in Jordan, in Israel, oh, they're going to get hit by Iranian missiles again and again. So what is the assessment on the part of Iranians when it comes to Israel? Israel doesn't want this because they want to do the same as they did in the West Bank and in Gaza, in Lebanon right now, in Syria. And this is the moment that the acts of resistance says, no, you're not going to go that far. Everything has changed as an outcome of this war.
I think the Israeli regime definitely wants the Americans to remain in the region. And it provides the Israeli regime a front line of defense. But what has happened is that the US bases alongside Iran are not sustainable anymore. And the Arab economies in the Persian Gulf, which invest their money in the West, they're consumer societies. The regimes are very corrupt. They purchase huge amounts of American weapons that they have no clue about how to use, as we saw in this war, and all their extra money, if it's not purchased on goods that come from the West and China and elsewhere, that money will go to U.S. stocks and U.S. bonds or investment in the West, which strengthens the United States.